Former President Trump says he plans to appeal the Colorado Supreme Court's decision to disqualify him from the state's ballot. Trump has until January 4th to file his appeal. Colorado Secretary of State Jena Griswold joins us now. Madam Secretary, it's good to see you. I'm going to ask you a couple of basic questions for the benefit of our audience. Did you bring this litigation to the Colorado Supreme Court?
Thanks for having me on. And no, I did not bring this litigation.
Who did?
6 Colorado voters who are Republican or unaffiliated voters filed a lawsuit seeking a court to determine that Donald Trump is disqualified for engaging in the insurrection.
And how do you regard the Supreme Court's decision?
I agree with the Supreme Court's decision. There have been 2 courts that have looked at the substance as to whether Donald Trump engaged in an insurrection, and they both determined that he did. The Colorado Supreme Court determined also that he is barred because of his actions under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. There shouldn't be a loophole for the president if the president decides to engage in insurrection or rebellion.
And how do you regard the dissent in the split opinion? It was 4-3 on the Colorado Supreme Court. One of the dissenting justices said the former president was denied due process because he hasn't been tried and convicted of a charge of insurrection.
Historically, a criminal conviction was not required to be disqualified under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Now, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that any person who swears to uphold the Constitution and then subsequently engages in insurrection or rebellion cannot hold office. It was put into place after the Civil War during Reconstruction and was used to remove hundreds of Confederate soldiers and officials. And there has not been a history of requiring a criminal prosecution. It does, this case has a court case. It's had 2 court cases, a district court and now the Colorado Supreme Court.
What are the implications for Colorado voters in terms of the upcoming Super Tuesday Colorado primary?
At this point, Donald Trump is disqualified from the Colorado ballot. Now, Trump has indicated he will appeal the case to the United States Supreme Court. And when he does that, he becomes qualified again, and the United States Supreme Court can determine whether they take the case and what they decide in the case, of course.
And if the Supreme Court takes the case, but also, if you'll allow me, takes its time and doesn't offer an opinion one way or the other before January 5th, what happens to Donald Trump's name in regards to the upcoming primary?
If this case is appealed and the United States Supreme Court takes the case, Donald Trump will be presumed eligible on the ballot. I do believe that if the United States Supreme Court takes the case, there is a high likelihood that they may not resolve the whole case by January 5th when I certify the ballot, but there's a high likelihood that they'll act in some capacity. But just like you, we have to hold tight and see if the appeals process moves forward. But as of right now, Donald Trump is disqualified from the ballot in the state of Colorado.
Madam Secretary, I've talked to a couple of constitutional lawyers about this who don't have a political point of view one way or the other, but they say one thing the U.S. Supreme Court might do is say, well, you know, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment doesn't specifically say president or vice president, therefore it doesn't apply. Therefore, the Colorado Supreme Court case can be overturned, that ruling can be overturned, simply because the plain language of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment doesn't apply, and we're going to override on that basis. Do you think that is possible?
There are a lot of arguments out there by legal scholars that lean progressive and conservative, who are not in agreement with each other. It is possible the Supreme Court goes down that path. It's also possible that the Supreme Court affirms the Colorado State Supreme Court in determining Trump is ineligible. Look, Donald Trump incited the insurrection. He tried to stop the peaceful transfer of the presidency, trying to steal the presidential election from the American people. In Section 3 of the 14th Amendment has clear language. So I do believe the Colorado Supreme Court got it right. But unlike Donald Trump, I will follow whatever court decision is in place, the law, the U.S. Constitution, when it comes time to certify the election.
I wonder, Madam Secretary, if you have a reaction to some of the Republicans who I've seen quoted saying this decision is anti-democratic and disenfranchises voters. Do you find any irony in that?
Yes, it's ironic because Donald Trump literally tried to steal the presidency. That is the only reason that this case moved forward, because of his actions. So I think at the end of the day, we all need to follow the law in the United States Constitution. And it's Donald Trump's failure to do that that got us into this place in the first to start with. When it comes down to it, the provision that would bar someone who has engaged in rebellion or insurrection is there to protect the United States government, to protect this country from a threat from within. So we are seeing the judicial process play out. That is democratic for a court case to move forward. And it's also democratic to listen to whatever court's decisions come forward on the issue.
The Colorado Republican Party said today that if this ruling by the Supreme Court of Colorado is upheld, it will shift to a caucus. Is there any problem with that?
Yes, there is not the ability to cancel a presidential primary because a political party wants to cancel it. So when we're talking about undemocratic tendencies, Colorado overwhelmingly voted to have presidential primaries. So that will move forward. And I think if there is an effort to try to thwart the will of the people in the presidential primary, there's a good likelihood there will be lawsuits filed and further litigation.
So if it shifts to caucus, there will be litigation over that very question.
There is not the ability to cancel a presidential primary in the state of Colorado because a political party wants to do a caucus.
Understood.
So that's not legal.
Understood. And this will be a simple question, but I just want to help our audience. Does the Supreme Court decision in Colorado cover both the primary ballot and the general election ballot? I know one follows the other, but I just want to clarify that point from your understanding, Madam Secretary.
But that's a really good question. And I think if Donald Trump is disqualified on the presidential primary, there's a high likelihood that another court case would be filed for the general. But at the end of the day, if the Colorado Supreme Court has already determined that he's disqualified for the presidential primary, it is very likely that the same determination would be made in the general. But we, before all those hypotheticals play out, we have to see if the United States Supreme Court decides to take the case.
The 39th Secretary of the State of Colorado, Secretary of State, rather, of the State of Colorado, Jena Griswold, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.